So there's a lot of talk going on about now being the most exciting period since the jet age. This is the start of a fourth industrial revolution. James, do you agree?
I tend to sort of think that revolution is maybe too strong. It's there's so much that's just evolving. It's and maybe it looks a bit like a revolution because there's so much communication about things. But what's really happening is probably just more evolving.
Really? So things like 3D printing, or additive manufacturing at the atomic level is now possible. AI. You don't see this as the start of a new...
No, I don't really, because I think that...
okay, well, thanks very much. That was a great panel.
I think these are...
Sorry you guys didn't get a chance to speak.
These are great new technologies to be embraced and to find out what they can do for things, but I think it's just another evolution of what we're...
I'll just say I think we are going through some sort of a revolution. Whether or not it's hitting business aviation, I don't think so yet. I think it's mostly in applications that are exterior to business aviation as we see it at the moment, and maybe it'll evolve separately.
You see, I agree with you, and I think that's also, rather than James, not for the first time. And I think that's, I think there's so much going on in automotive technology that will end up in aviation, or is already starting to. Mike?
I have to say, I agree with James. It's not a revolution in business aviation per se, but there are changes happening which I hope will come into business aviation eventually. I think it's pockets of major breakthroughs happening, but they haven't come to market yet in our sector.
So is that because business aviation, although the products, the aircraft are constantly evolving, constantly being technologically advanced, is that because this is an industry that's slow to adopt new technology?
I think the OEMs adopt new technology. In fact, they probably lead in technology in the cockpit and certain areas of the cabin as well, and aerodynamics, composite materials, all of that. But where I see the revolution of the new technology that could really make a difference is in the operational front of making it more efficient for the end client experience of using those jets and equipment.
I think aviation has always been in the forefront of technology. Whether or not the pace of change right now of technology outside of aviation is too fast for business aviation or general aviation to keep up with is, to me, what's the holdback. If business aviation, obviously with all the safety and regulatory difficulties, needs to evolve in a different pace, I think other technologies are advancing faster or too fast for business aviation.
Well, I think that aviation has faced a number of challenges in terms of regulation, and I was speaking with in the UK government a green paper recently, and it's great to see in their sort of vision of 2050 future aviation strategy that they recognise that they probably need to have a lighter touch when it comes to regulation and especially with new technologies to allow adoption. That when you hide behind some of the things and call it's because of safety, but it's not necessarily inherently unsafe. And I think that there's a great opportunity in this region, perhaps in particular, because of the emerging of this industry to take on new things, to be the very best. Whereas perhaps in the US and in Europe, some things in the US and Europe are just a lot easier to do. So, but that might make people a little bit lazy and sort of leave them behind. So the best operators will be pushing to find little marginal gains in all aspects of their business and not sitting on their laurels. So embrace the technology, figure out which bits are going to work for you, and keep pressing ahead.
Mike, any comments on regulators in the region?
I think, surprisingly, they're actually very open to now listening to our sector. I think there's people in the room that I know very well. 8 years ago, we walked into the Hong Kong CAD and we literally got thrown out in the first meeting when we asked about, slots and parking. Actually, parking was the issue at that point in Hong Kong. But now, I would say there's an open door policy, and it's actually up to us to go and make the effort to meet with them on a regular basis and keep educating them about what our needs are. And we were talking about this offline, but we hope that there will be a light touch on regulation and more self-regulating, if you like, but we have to sort of prove to them that we're capable of self-regulation in how we adopt this new technologies.
Yeah, just touching on Asia specifically, maybe it's an advantage in some way that infrastructure and regulations are not as mature as other places in the world. So for them to adapt to new technology and a revolution may be actually easier. The infrastructure is not in place right now for other older technologies, so why not just skip it and be more open to new development?
Do you think, so we run a conference called Revolution.aero in San Francisco and London, and we have hundreds of, there's 110 startup companies trying to launch VTOL, electric aircraft or vertical takeoff and landing aircraft. I always think the landing is redundant. You should just assume that it will do that before you get in it. But do you think that the people who are coming into this industry to disrupt it understand how hard it is to meet regulators' requests?
I think they don't understand, but they're learning on the hard way. And eventually, if they're persistent enough, they're going to have to learn and maybe borrow some knowledge and expertise from real people who are in business aviation at the moment. And it'll be a process, but eventually adjust to what's needed.
Okay, so we have this diagram of some of the new technologies that are coming and being worked on. James, which one of those do you think is the most overhyped?
Urban air mobility. I think that the challenge of why a lot of the reason why you might want to do urban air mobility is to do with land mobility having some problems. But if you can solve the problem of urban air mobility, I think you'd almost immediately solve the problem of congestion in cities with just better management and taking human sort of error out of that decision loop. So I think that the mobility part of it is interesting, and it might be that it's actually more about connecting rural areas and changing the way that the infrastructure works in countries, and the opportunity for spreading the load away from the urban centres.
Mike, do you agree?
I disagree. So it's already happening, urban air mobility, but the first adoption is always going to be cargo because it doesn't involve people. And it's already happening here in Asia. Actually, Asia is the fastest growing adoption of urban air mobility ahead of America, despite we only hear that it comes out of Long Beach and places like that. But so I'll give you a few examples. So EHang announced at A-Base that they'd done 30,000 test flights to 6,000 clients around the Guangzhou area with CAC's knowledge.
It would have been a brave announcement without to say we've just done this
exactly, in China, yeah. And just on the 29th of May, they did their first commercial flight with DHL China from Guangzhou. So it's already happening. And then you've got JD.com, the arch rival of Alibaba, who've just done their first overseas test flight in Indonesia early this year, also with cargo under 5 kilo payload, home parcel delivery services. So you're going to see that, I think, more and more. And it comes back to Nadav's part, where there's this sort of lack of education or knowledge or historic issues that you may face in the West of regulation. It doesn't exist, so they're just skipping and going straight, okay, what do we need to do to make this work for the OEM that's bringing it to market? And they're bringing it to market, so I disagree.
I don't know. Well, I'm just taking a guess.
No, I think what Mike said is true, but I do agree that it's overhyped. And I think it's the last question, but I think it is going to take a while until it's a reality. So yes, as a first stage, maybe some light cargo, but if later on, if you want to envision a situation where you have cargo air vehicles of some sort flying around, plus urban mobility of human beings inside a city, it's going to be one big beehive.
Can I just comment? How light is light cargo?
It could be anything from a 1 foot box to...
Because there's already been a 1 ton piece tested by JD.com in the north of China under a drone.
Yeah, no doubt that it can lift. I mean, the equipment is there to lift equipment. Whether or not the airspace will be open enough to enable real mass movement, I don't know.
As someone who has dedicated a lot of your professional life to helicopters, does it upset you that you've got all these people saying how helicopters are rubbish and the future is all drone?
Not at all.
Okay, if we could go back to the slide for a minute. 88% of the people here. Nadav, would you like to pick? Is there anything on there that excites you?
No, I'm kidding. Maybe, not excites me, but I think the most relevant or most important point right now is actually the Internet of Aircraft. Maybe that's where we'll see the biggest change as a first stage of revolution.
James?
I think that
You agree with the Internet of Aircraft, don't you?
No, well, I like that one too, but I like the autonomy one. I think that's going to, and whether it's autonomy or semi-autonomy, and the ability to improve the sort of human and machine interface and that relationship will be. I think that will be incredibly empowering and enabling for lots of different things. And I think that would also, I know there's lots of efforts to try and solve the very difficult problems, which is great. And but some of the other problems, humans are really good at some things, and computers are not so good at them yet. But there are some great opportunities there. I mean, there's talk of the trough of pilots, a demographic trough of not enough pilots in the world. Technology could probably alleviate that to a great degree, but you would also need to have, an acceptance that it was okay for an aircraft to be operated by a single pilot with assistance from maybe some sort of ground infrastructure and a connected support system, but as well as the equipment on board the aircraft that supports autonomy or semi-autonomy.
I think they're both very, very related, by the way. Those two specifically are very connected. So
I'll pick just selfishly, because I think from a perceptual point of view, our industry is seen as a high polluter. So I'm going for the electrification and alternative energy. So I don't know if you're aware, but back in January, there was the first demonstration of the aviation sustainable fuel usage in Van Nuys. And the second demonstration was commenced out of Farnborough Tag Airport just before E-Base, where 27 aircraft uplifted at 4 different airports and flew into Geneva with aviation sustainable fuel composite in their tanks. So I would say it's a key issue for our industry to keep driving that in order to meet the CO2 emissions targets, which are in the early 2020s. So for me, it's continuing along that path, and I'd love to see that third demonstration come to be in Asia somehow, maybe in 2020, with people's support from the fuel companies. Thank you.
And I think that's probably a big weak point of the industry, is the environmental. Actually, you can get it. It's one of the few places you can get sustainable jet fuel is New Zealand, so it's coming here. We've got a question, actually it's a comment, I think. For your information, a Singapore GLC is targeting pilot-less cargo airliners with a working proof of concept vehicle already established. So that's someone else commenting on the future. Do you think business aviation will be the last aviation industry to lose pilots, though?
Yes.
Yeah, I think so, yeah, just because of the nature of who's in the back.
I'm not sure we'll lose them so quickly. The role and the responsibilities might change a little bit, and they already have in the way that pilots operate the aircraft, and whether or not they have to be good handling pilots, or are they system management?
I always like questions like this because I think when people look at the future, you can usually tell when people are planning to retire. And that's when they see the big change. Mike, I should have given you a chance to explain Mobi. Do you want to take us through what your new company is doing?
Well, basically, it's just going more into the advisory side of house, of getting out of the operational side of aircraft management per se, but helping companies who wish to enter Asia or expand their footprint in Asia, both in an aerospace area, whether it's traditional or the future. So helping companies, perhaps like Volocopter, Terrafugia, who are trying to bring product to market but don't yet have that government relations either. So I really see the use of my 12 years here and experience to be able to shortcut that bridge in making the relationships and educating to bring the product to market. Thank you.
Crystal balls, basically.
Crystal balls. Thank you, Nadav.
James, do you think there's a lot of hype? You can say that there's links to the VLJ or similarities to the very light jet boom. Do you think business aviation companies the light jet? Well, there was a boom because you had a bust, so you had to have had a boom. Do you see business aviation companies leading the way with new technology, or staying off in their existing business?
Okay. I think that business aviation will expand its kind of mode of operation into a wider range of point-to-point transportation. I think that there could be the increased democratization of access to it will be helpful. There's certainly plenty of lift capacity at the moment, but is it accessible and easily accessible for people that have not used it before? Those things are potentially changing at the moment, and then as that does happen, if that does happen, then we should see certain other things start to reduce the cost of accessing it, perhaps, and or its accessibility in all sorts of other different ways, whether it's the cost of the aircraft to manufacture them, or what problems they're actually solving. Can we manufacture aircraft that are specific mission profiles for a smaller area, rather than trying a sort of one size fits all?
I'm just looking at the question on the screen and getting distracted there because it's pointed directly at me, but maybe I can switch tack just to answer the question that's on Slido very quickly, because I think James has answered that other question. The one-ton scenario, by the way, that's obviously in a controlled environment, but test center, but the idea is for that sort of payload, it would be they would be able to keep it away from highly populated areas, because they don't necessarily have to go point to point, and they can be going around and to a distribution center, whatever it is. So I don't think it's a like for like. It's the lower payload for the home delivery, little parcels under 5 kilos typically.
But that's still going to sting, isn't it? If one of those falls on you as you're walking along, How do you? So one of the interesting things is the UK set up an air accident investigations branch in 1912, and it only set up a rail one in 2010. People don't like things flying over them. Do you see, the US intercity helicopter market was pretty much shut down by one helicopter, crashing on top of a building in Chicago, a long time ago.
Yeah, but it wouldn't happen a few days ago and nothing. I mean, New York's still flying. It happens frequently.
So you don't see this as a big concern?
I think it's a huge concern, but I think as time goes by, they'll also find ways to cope with the risks of autonomous aircraft lifting equipment or transporting people.
I mean, most of these systems have redundancies, otherwise they're not going to be allowed to be certified. So I think the minimum is 2 or 3 redundancy systems have to be in place for it to be certified, according to China regulations. But there's also been that question, I won't go into that, but it's, you could be walking along the street and a loose window falls on your head from a skyscraper in Hong Kong because it wasn't well maintained. So I don't know, Safety is paramount in the industry, and I think that will continue, but we shouldn't stop innovation just because of fear of something happening.
I think it's interesting when you go to a proof of concept and what that concept is that you're trying to prove that you can do, but what it actually results in could be completely different. And I think we do need to remain open-minded about where some of these solutions or technological solutions could take us, and what future problems they might solve, or how they might change the world in a different way to what we can conceive of right now.
Okay. How can, I think there's more focus on aviation now. There's far more investment in early stage startup companies. We have all the new technologies coming in. So, how can people pick which are going to be the winners?
I mean, there's a few leading contenders already, right? I mean, all the major manufacturers are in this space already. That's how serious they're taking it. So you've got Embraer X. They just announced their Beacon platform. Their first customer is Jet Suite X, which is funded by Qatar Airways. They're very keen to grow that network of all different facets of the urban air mobility as a platform under Embraer X's knowledge and experience. Plus you've got Boeing next, you've got A3 Airbus, you've got Lithium, Volocopter I've mentioned earlier. So most of the manufacturers are involved, and that also spills down to the supply chain of Rolls-Royce engine. The engine development changes, it becomes a different concept to power these things, which I'm sure Rolls-Royce is looking at this as well, and others. So it does mean, I think it's a new area for entire business aviation supply chain to be looking at, and if they're not, they're going to be maybe behind the curve.
I think these are all the OEMs, these are manufacturers, which is important, but the ones who will win are the ones who can make the operation work, because that's to me where the big challenge is actually. Technology is great, but whether or not we can make it work as the macro operational sphere, that's a big question.
But can I just come back on that? Because there is regulation committees set up in America at RPAS, remote aerial aircraft systems, which is set up in the US. It has FAA on its panel, it has IBAC on its panel. So they're actually forming the regulation in order to make it easier to operate these autonomous vehicles in America, and I think whatever comes out of these will start to be adopted as international standards under ICAO.
James, you work for a big aerospace company. Are you backing the big aerospace companies to win?
I don't know what you mean by that question. There's so many things that people are, when you're trying to solve problems, though, it's like, well, what problem are you actually trying to solve? And that becomes part of normal business planning, which we obviously do. We do all this. We have an advanced technology center. They're looking at things for the future. They do experimental stuff. I mean, it's quite interesting, and the ideas that are there. But ultimately, the market will decide whether you solved a problem either for very many people at a relatively low cost, in which case you're going to make some money, or if you just solved a problem for a few people who are then going to have to pay, really value it and pay an awful lot for it. So business aviation currently solves a transportation problem. It was originally more about time saving and direct access to get to places that weren't necessarily well served by commercial airlines. It was born in the USA because of the way the aerospace structure was there, and it did solve a problem. As other technologies have come in and changed it, the actual travel dynamic has changed as well. So how people are using business aviation, whether or not it needs to be, is speed the main problem to solve when you've got such a nice environment to be in for a period of time that it would be difficult to see that it was any worse than any office. So that changes things a little bit. figure out what problem it is that you're actually trying to solve, and whether or not technology is necessary. Some things are just science experiments to figure out, can we do this? And the result will be different. I don't know if I answered your question.
I'm not sure what question you answered. If you even did answer a question.
I think you...
So do you think it's...
I was trying to answer it as me rather than as a representative of...
Rockwell Collins.
Yeah.
Sorry, Collins Aerospace. Sorry, Raytheon. I lose track. Okay, how quickly will we see changes?
Well, I just mentioned, I think we're already seeing the changes, we're just not aware of them unless you read about it. So I'm thinking it's going to continue. You're going to see more launches of new products, such as air taxi services. I think Max touched about it yesterday, that there's a helicopter new air taxi service, or I think earlier today, I should say, in Manila. And there's already one in Indonesia. So helicopters will be the first adoption for passenger, because that does still have pilots and it's regulated and safety, despite there's still crashes happen. But cargo, from autonomy point of view, will be the first adoption over the next 10 years. That will be, I think, the technology is there, operations is there. I think for passenger side, it's more of a psychological thing. I'm not sure I'd want to go up in one of those without a pilot in it, regardless of all the fail-safes, because I'm scared of heights.
At our London conference, we had a VTOL manufacturer going, the problem is the pilots weigh a lot. So that actually, economically, so he was going, now's a great time to be a retired jockey. Nadav?
I think it's going to take time. I think it's beyond 10 years before we see real change in the usage of air mobility, for example. 15 plus.
15 plus years.
I mean, it's changing all the time, of course, but until we really see autonomous vehicles flying around freely, I think we're quite far away.
Well, I think if you look at some of the, if you were to look at established markets where people are trying to get things changed, and then say, well, we're not as an established market, but maybe we can get in front of our regulators and government and encourage an earlier adoption rate, there might be a chance to kind of leapfrog ahead of even the established areas.
Question from Paul Jebley. just for the record, Paul Jebley's rate of approved questions that make it through is very low. Nadav, in a society where pizza gets to your house before the police, why would you ever order pizza at the same time as calling the police to prove this? Is there a market for law enforcement for these mobile platforms?
It already is. Law enforcement are using them all the time. It's like the first market, actually.
Okay.
Thanks.
And also medical. I think medical is a big sector that these autonomous vehicles will be an enabler to these remote regions, easier to get to.
Okay. So in The Graduate, the film The Graduate, there's the famous scene where not that famous scene, where they recommend, rubbers or plastics or chemicals as the future business. Which is the future technology that you would be betting on to change business aviation first?
Hydrogen-powered battery technology.
I was going to say power technology. I don't know which, but yes, I think that's the game changer.
Battery or
energy? Yep. And maybe, I don't know, connectivity of the platform somehow in the air, which will be linked to aerospace. I mean, I can't answer that, actually.
I don't know, but I'm still going to bet on people, because in business aviation, I think that is going to be important. And even with all these technologies and the threats from the sort of perceived threats, people working with people more effectively.
Okay. Finally, what year, I don't need day or month, just what year, will people be leaving this conference in a urban VTOL?
When I've persuaded property owners who own these kind of hotels to change their rooftops to enable them to land on it.
So what year is that?
When do I retire? 2032.
Doesn't matter. 2032.
2032?
I have no idea, but I think it's a lot further off at the moment than that. I don't think it's 15 years away. And if it is, I think it'll still be fewer.
Uber, which is its conference in Washington today, is still saying 2023 for Dallas.
Okay.
If it is a serious question, I do think it actually is beyond 2032. I don't see, if you're really thinking about a situation where we walk out of here and each one gets on their little hovering vehicle, I think it's far.
All my questions are serious.
Do you mean, okay, Al, so do you mean as something that nearly everybody uses every day? Or do you see it as something still more exclusive but available?
I think that's the big argument personally, is that urban air mobility, I think, is a fantastic now you're asking a serious answer for a serious person. Urban air mobility is, I think, getting all the hype. But if you look at the adoption of every transport, aircraft were not Airbuses to start with. They were niched, and I think there's a huge demand. Embraer have had people contacting them since they announced their UAV, their VTOL. They've had owners contacting them saying, can you take us through, can you explain this? If you talk to operators in LA, they're getting significant interest, or San Francisco. Actually, San Francisco is a very anti-helicopter market, isn't it? But there are people ready to fly around Napa in electric, and I see that business aviation will be the natural area for this, not Uber, to start with. And even this means I can't ever get an Uber. But we had investors in San Francisco going, one of them said Uber's batshit crazy. It's never going to happen. And I think that maybe they're dominating it too much.
Well, they need to start making money soon, otherwise they won't exist.
And I think we'll end on a great quote from the great Paul Jebley. Remember, with sufficient thrust, even pigs can fly. So, anyone like to comment on that?
Well, that just follows David Best's comments about our industry, wasn't it? It's pigs with lipstick on, or something he said, wasn't it?
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.